Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Today we are discussing a new book that's just come out called A Shared Struggle, Stories of Palestinian and Irish Hunger Strikes. The book is a contribution by 31 different Palestinian-Irish activists who went on hunger strikes. And they speak about their first-hand experience of going on hunger strike in Israel, and of course in Ireland and UK. We have one of the editors of the book, Danny Morrison, who is a former political activist and now also an author. He was also imprisoned several times, charged with being a member of the IRA. Later on in his life, he was a representative to the Stormont Assembly. During the 1981 hunger strike, he was a spokesperson for Bobby Sands, who died on May, 6 days later, following his hunger strike. He has also been the chair of the West Belfast Festival. Danny is also, as I mentioned, an author of several books. Most recently, as I mentioned, he is the editor, of A Shared Struggle of Stories from Palestine and Ireland. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mr. Good to speak to you.
Good to speak to you. The book's been endorsed by a number of prominent people, including Jerry Adams. And I wanted to begin with a question based on a comment he made regarding the parallels between the historic struggle for freedom and commonality of resistance against overwhelming military odds. And the commonality between the Palestinian struggle and the Irish struggle. So he mentions that. So can you maybe share with us some of these parallels between the Palestinian and Irish struggle as reflected in the book?
Well, aside from the history of hunger strike and imprisonment, both our nations, of course, are victims of British imperialism and colonialism. And if you look back to, for example, the First World War, where Britain promised Irish people that if you fought for us in the First World War, we will give you independence at the end of it. They promised the same to India, and they promised the same to the Arab peoples in the Middle East. And of course, my country is still partitioned, although now our course is a political course, because we're quite confident that we can get our independence and end British rule through political action. India, which also participated in the First World War on behalf of England with the same promise, didn't get its independence until 1948, 1949, and the cost of it was partition, with 1 million people dying when borders suddenly went up overnight. And of course, the Palestinian nation is still waiting for its freedom. And Irish Republicans consider it to be what is happening to the Palestinian people to be probably the worst attempt at oppression and repression. They're trying to do away with the Palestinian people in their entirety, and we're witnessing that in the way, for example, the Native American people were wiped out by Europeans, but at a time when there was no social media, no mass media, and yet it's happening before our eyes. And it is, to me, it is a blight on humankind in the 21st century.
As I mentioned earlier, you've been imprisoned several times, and I'm, of course, assuming you follow the Palestinian issue quite closely. And I remember a number of times when I met with Irish activists, also previous activists who were on hunger strike, speak about the solidarity of Palestinians and how that made them feel. How do you feel watching Palestinians who have been on hunger strike and generally their cause and fight for freedom and justice against Israeli occupation?
Well, again, people throughout history, and particularly when people are in struggle against colonial powers, when you're in prison, the only thing you have left is your will and your body against that. And I mean, the first Irish Republican hunger striker died in September 1917, Thomas Ashe. He was force-fed and he choked to death when he was being force-fed by British military doctors. And of course, the famous hunger strike when 10 men died over a period of 7 months in the H blocks of Long Kesh. I mean, that electrified the world, and it led to a massive increase in support for the Republican cause. So I knew Bobby Sands, I knew several of our prisoners, but reading the stories of the Palestinian hunger strikers, there's so many parallels. I mean, even reading the poetry of Khalil Abu Aram, who is featured in the book, his writing and Bobby Sands' writing, they could have been written from the same cell, from the same point of view, from missing nature, from the deprivations, and also in the women's contribution in the book, which I think is extremely important. We had a famous Republican leader, James Connolly, who was executed by the British after the 1916 Rising. And Connolly used to refer to women as the slave of the slave. So it's very, very important that women, their role in our joint struggles is acknowledged. And I think that the women's contribution is very, very important and very moving. You have a woman, a prisoner there, Rada Habib, who was subject to administrative detention and gave birth while in prison. And that also happened to our female comrades in Armagh jail. So the parallels are there. Mary Doyle, who's a Republican who was on hunger strike in 1980. I mean, while she was in prison, loyalists supported by the British forces threw a bomb into a pub and killed her mother while she was in jail. So there are multiple parallels between our two struggles, and we're very proud as Irish Republicans, as internationalists, to show our solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. And indeed, the Palestinian flag flies over several of our premises. I'm speaking to you from West Belfast in Ireland. We fly the Palestinian flag in honour and in solidarity with them. And our elected representatives, of course, in the Irish Parliament, because there's two parliaments in Ireland as a result of partition. We haven't resolved that yet, but we're on our way to doing that. In the Southern Parliament in Dublin, Sinn Féin has put down a motion, and in all likelihood, given the opinion polls recently, Sinn Féin will be the leading party in the next government, probably coalition government, and Sinn Féin intends to pass a motion to recognise the state of Palestine. And we hope that that is a spur to other European countries and other progressive political parties to pass similar motions, because it's been going on too long, and it is time it is addressed. And what we have to address is the unconditional support that North America has for Israel and its dispossession of the people, its illegal occupation, the way it behaves, and the crimes it commits against civilians. So we are playing our part in that struggle, and we identify with Palestine as our brothers and sisters.
I mean, it's always heartening to cover stories actually from Ireland, showing their solidarity with the Palestinians, statements from Irish politicians. And it's always really heartening and enjoyable to actually cover those stories. But I wanted to quickly ask a question about the book itself. I mean, you mentioned some of the parallels and also the female contributors. But the book has over 31 contributions, I think, some in Arabic, which were translated. So how did the initial idea of putting together a book about the experience of the hunger strikes in Palestine and of Irish activists come about? And what was your role in that? Of course, you're one of the editors, but it seems like it's quite, what was the initial germs and beginnings of the idea?
Well, I was interviewing Asad Abu Sharkh, who's a Palestinian-Irish academic who lives in Dublin and who is the international spokesperson for the Great March of Return. And I was interviewing him as part of the Bloody Sunday weekend of political events. And he mentioned to me that a number of Palestinians were trying to put together a book. And as I was the secretary of the Bobby Sands Trust, would I participate? And I was so honored to be asked, and we began work on it. And later I was linked in with Yusuf, who did the translations, and Norma, who I think is based in Indonesia. She sponsored the book and supervised it. And myself and Asad, we collected the various writings. He sent them to me, I edited them, and I also contacted various surviving hunger strikers, because of course the book is about people who survived hunger strike. It's not like with Bobby Sands or Francis Hughes or Patsy Wara in Ireland who died on hunger strike. or Frank Stagg, who died in England on hunger strike, or Michael Gaughan. It's about surviving hunger strikers and their contribution, what they went through, the experience of suffering on hunger strike. Some of these prisoners were also on thirst strike, and one Irish prisoner in the 1940s only lasted 6 days on a hunger and thirst strike, Sean McCackey. So the suffering that they went through is incredible, and it's really interesting that they drew succor from their families, from thoughts of their towns, where they came from, their loved ones, the justness of their cause, the fact that there were people outside of that jail and abroad internationally who was thinking of them and supported them. And of course, our own hunger strike in Ireland was well known because, I mean, Bobby Sands was elected as an MP during his hunger strike. But Nelson Mandela remarked that whenever they were on Robben Island and they were planning a hunger strike, they would send notes to each other around the cells, and their hunger strike, the code word for their hunger strike was Sands. Get ready to do a Sands, and named after Bobby Sands. So I mean, it's so important, the solidarity between groups that are oppressed and suffer from the same enemy. And in our case, contemporary, and in Palestinian's case, historically, the British Empire. So that's what's very, very important. Also, I mean, one of the contributors to the book, I shared a cell, my cellmate, Pat Sheehan, because I was in jail 4 times, but when I went into jail on the last time for 8 years, the hunger strike was over and the prisoners had one political status. But my cellmate was a man called Pat Sheehan. And Pat Sheehan, who served in total 20 years, Pat, in the second term of imprisonment, he was on hunger strike for 55 days when the hunger strike finally ended on the 3rd of October 1981. So I ended up in the same cell as Pat. And interestingly, Pat is now the assembly member for West Belfast. He sits the Stormont Executive, but he's also Sinn Féin's spokesperson on the Middle East, and he has been in the West Bank. He's been in Gaza, as of course has Gerry Adams when he was president of Sinn Féin. So those links between us are organic, and you know they are emotional, they are historical, they are acts. We just identify so much with the Palestinian people. And what is interesting, of course, is that the loyalists in the north who want to maintain the links with Britain, and of course who historically were planted here when the Irish people were dispossessed and their property and lands and fields and hills and rivers were handed over, mostly in the north of Ireland, to the loyalists. The loyalists fly the Israeli flag in their areas, yes, and right. they completely justify everything, the war crimes of Israel. They justify them and identify with them.
No, that is right. I mean, one of the questions that obviously comes up when you cover the issue of Palestinian hunger strike is really how far back it goes. I mean, I was flicking through your book, and I think 1960s, 50s, and 60s is how far back it goes. But there's been, of course, this narrative which everyone knows about, which is that Palestinian resistance has always been violent. And one of the questions is always, where is the Palestinian Gandhi? As if the Palestinians have never peacefully demonstrated or protested against their occupation. Palestinian peaceful resistance is very, very old, but it's hardly known within the West. Why do you think that is? And also, can this form of peaceful resistance work in Israel in the way it has worked, say, in India with Gandhi? Is it really a different form of occupation, as it also was successful in Ireland? Can we compare the types of occupation in Israel with the British occupation of India? And also, why haven't we heard about the Palestinian peaceful resistance, even though it has such a long tradition going back to the 50s and 60s, as I mentioned?
Well, I mean, I'm no authority on India, but I think it would be wrong just to assume that Gandhi's quote-unquote peaceful hunger strikes and civil disobedience campaign was the main factor in forcing Britain to withdraw from India. I think Britain, first of all, it was very expensive to maintain the outpost in the subcontinent, and also had the British government not withdrawn, they would have faced militant and armed resistance, without a doubt. In the case of the way people who struggle and resist are deemed, the terminology used, I mean, if I go back to our own conflict here, British occupation was established here, plantation was established here. When we marched for civil rights in the 1960s, it was peaceful. We were beaten into the ground. Eventually, government forces invaded our areas and burnt thousands of people out of their homes and shot dead people in an attempt to drive us out of Belfast in particular, or National House in particular. But if you look at the mass media coverage, if you look at the British government and the unionist spokespersons at that time, the word violence isn't used until the IRA fires the first shot. And the IRA doesn't fire the first shot until after many, many people have been killed. And there's been many egregious acts of violence by the state. So similarly, it would be great if governments responded to non-violent action. But the use of force, particularly by oppressed people, is a last resort, because it's we who suffer. It's we who are killed. It's we, our brothers and sisters, who go to jail. It's our families' homes that are torn apart. The people who are in government, like for example Mrs. Thatcher, they were going home every night to their big houses and their comfortable homes, and our prisoners were in hunger strike, and our people were being killed on the streets. In Belfast, throughout the hunger strike, in the 7 months of 1981, the British forces fired 30,000 plastic bullets, which are lethal. They killed people, they killed children during that period. So the terminology used is hypocritical. I will not dictate, nor will I circumscribe for another group that is oppressed and more oppressed than I am. Where I am doing this interview from, in West Belfast, we have achieved major gains. At the bottom of my street, there was a British Army RUC barracks. As a result of our peace dividend, they have withdrawn. That land has been handed to our community. We have built a park there. In other military barracks which have been emptied, we've built houses and creches and offices and art centres, etc. So we are very lucky in Ireland, and we cannot forget our brothers and sisters in Palestine, who the suffering is indescribable. I mean, Gaza alone is an open prison, where the Israelis, with their multi-million-dollar jet aircrafts, bomb civilian areas, and it is a scandal. So the use of the argument between what works, peaceful tactics, yes, people should use them. Unfortunately, people feel often driven out of frustration, and because they do not see their protests having any effect, to the use of armed force, and that is regrettable. But the overwhelming use of force, either initially is used by the state in order to consolidate its position, and from then on, it writes the rule book that to resist them is evil and violent and immoral, even though those are the terms upon which they originally occupied and took control of land. So, I have followed the Palestinians and the people who have worked peacefully. I've met many academics, but at the same time, Israel has shown absolutely no response to the entitlements of the Palestinian people against successive United Nations resolutions. And these are supposed to mean something. And yet they do not deliver for the Palestinian people. Israel ignores them, continues to occupy land, continues to evict people, continues to try and establish facts on the ground. In other words, that if in some future there are meaningful negotiations and a meaningful resolution, they will claim, oh no, this has been in our possession for a decade now. Our people cannot be moved. It is a disgrace, and I hope that our book, A Shared Struggle, is read by many, many people around the world. And I hope that in reading that book, people will come to realize the difficulties, the oppression of the Palestinian people, and will come to show solidarity and real support for them by supporting BDS and by also recognizing the Palestinian state.
If I can pick up on the last bit of your response to my previous question about BDS and global solidarity. I think, as you mentioned, hunger strike and peaceful resistance alone has never succeeded in ending brutal military occupation. The idea that Gandhi's hunger strike alone was sufficient, or in Ireland or South Africa, hunger strike alone would be sufficient, is actually a misreading of history and complete error. So I think, do you think then, I mean, what's required, I would say, is a global moral outrage of what's happening wherever there is colonization and occupation. But I think, do you think that this is happening now with regards to Palestine, with the rise of BDS, with endless reports on Israeli apartheid by Human Rights Watch, a number of other organizations? I think we've kind of, moved into the arena where peaceful hunger strike would resonate more and more. People around the world would see the violence and become morally outraged. And we are now shifting in a position where peaceful resistance could shift the balance of power on the side of the Palestinians.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I know Israel is funded by the United States, and they're guaranteed their security by the United States. But there's no doubt about it. I mean, there are good people in the United States, just as there are good people in Europe and in Ireland and elsewhere. And if you offer them an alternative and you say to them, look, how did the anti-apartheid movement affect the South African regime? It hurt them in the pocket. The boycott of South African goods, and even including the boycott of the arms industry in South Africa, which debilitated the South African military forces. These things can work. We know from history that they can work. And so it's something that we can offer people, a peaceful way. Watch what you're buying. Is it coming from, is it the people who are selling this? Is this from stolen land? Is this from lands and olive groves that have been taken over by occupiers? So I think, I mean, the BDS movement, I think, presents great possibilities. And of course, if you supply the Palestinian people and the people in Gaza and in the West Bank with hope, and they see the BDS movement biting, and you can see, for example, Israel is terrified of it because they look at the extent that they're going to try and equate a simple boycott with being anti-Zionist. They think this is their trump card. All they have to do is accuse you of being anti-Zionist, and by extensions, if you're justifying the Holocaust, they play this emotional card, and yet it is a good card. It is morally right to boycott people who are selling stolen goods from stolen land. And I think that the BDS movement presents a great opportunity in the coming years now. And in North America, I mean, I speak to many people in North America, and a lot of them see the merit in it. And I think that the support for Palestine is increasing. And I think that we have a role in Ireland as Irish Republicans, especially when Sinn Féin gets into power, of recognizing the state of Palestine, creating this slow movement and persuading others to create a momentum that Israel cannot stop. Israel has to be forced into recognizing the rights of the Palestinian people. Now, and ideally we want to do that peacefully, without loss of life, without suffering, without administrative detention, without bombing Gaza, without kidnappings in the West Bank, and it can be done. And it's actually in the interests of the people in Israel to reach a peaceful settlement. I don't know how in their heads how they can cope with lying on beaches, sunbathing, and a few miles down the road, kids are being killed for their security. I mean, that alone is morally reprehensible.
I mean, the tide is definitely turning, and we cover reports every single day of concerns by Israeli officials about the loss of support within, not just within many US politicians, but within the Jewish community in the US. You see polls after polls showing that, more and more increasing number of young Jews are alienated with the Israeli occupation. But in any case, I mean, I wanted to end with a question about lessons that can be learned from your experience with the British and in finally getting to the Good Friday Agreement. Is there lessons which Palestinians can learn from that? And also, did hunger strikes, peaceful resistance play any role with Britain changing its course towards the Irish?
Well, it's quite a complex question with a complex answer. I mean, the role of the prisoners on hunger strike knew that their hunger strike whilst it was immediately about prison conditions and forcing the British government to recognise them as political prisoners, it had a much bigger repercussions than that. And in the same way as the 1916 Rising electrified the Irish people and resulted in the subsequent War of Independence against British forces, the hunger strikers realised that they were taking on Britain, and it was a battle of wills. And what they represented was the right of the Irish people, the independence, against Britain's claim to be able to imprison us in our own country. And as a result of Bobby Sands winning a Westminster general election, or a Westminster by-election, that propelled us to adopt an electoral strategy. And since then, of course, Sinn Féin is the second largest party in the north of Ireland and the largest party in the south of Ireland. But in terms of what eventually brought peace about, the IRA in the early 1990s was better armed than ever. And it could have fought on for another 15, 20, 30 years without necessarily improving its negotiating position. And we had reached a situation where leading British military commanders began to give interviews and issue statements saying that they could not defeat the IRA and it required a political settlement. And I think that was the seeds of the peace process. I think as Republicans, we also had to admit that we had to compromise because the war could go on forever, but without necessarily reaching any type of settlement. So both sides, from similar points of view, that there was a military stalemate, that we needed it to be resolved politically. That brought forward the IRA ceasefire of 1994. I was actually in prison when it was called, and that ceasefire led to negotiations and the Good Friday Agreement. But of course, as far as we're concerned, the Good Friday Agreement is only a staging post. It isn't a settlement. It's an interim step that we are using, and we've been quite frank and open about this, that we see it as a way of slowly harmonising socially and economically policies on both sides of the Irish border. And of course, Brexit has played a huge part in this, because as a result of the negotiations between the European Union and Britain, Britain has been forced to allow the north of Ireland, for all intents and purposes, to remain in the common market, in the European Union. And this has meant that there's a border down the Irish Sea, and that has intensified north-south trade. And we foresee the use of politics and political developments has been in our favour. The way things are going, it favours Irish unity, and we're glad that the war is over and conflict is over. And we hope that as a result of our solidarity and work with Palestinians, that we can help put pressure on the Israeli government to force it to begin talking to the Palestinian people.
Strangely enough, the direction of travel in both countries seems to be some form of Republican settlement. After Brexit, Republican Ireland seems to be the end conclusion. I think in Palestine as well, some form of republicanism where all different communities, Jews, Christians, Palestinian, Muslims, all live together seems to be where we're heading. If not now, but that seems to be the
well, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be my role as an Irish Republican who lives outside that area to circumscribe the nature or predetermine the outcome. Whatever is good enough and satisfies the Palestinians, and they receive peace with justice and the promise of a prosperity future. And as Bobby Sands said, it's all about the laughter of our children, and it's the next generation that comes after us. So whatever is good enough for the Palestinians, we will support them.
So where can people buy the book from, Danny? Where can we purchase it from?
Well, my understanding is that it is available in London. The publisher of the book, incidentally, is on Ishog, and that's an Irish bookshop on the Falls Road. And Ishog means, it's Irish, it means the lark, and it comes after a famous Bobby Sands story called The Lark and the Freedom Fighter. So this little shop has published the book in collaboration with our Palestinian comrades abroad, and so it's available in Belfast and Dublin. If anybody goes on the Bobby Sands Trust website, just Google Bobby Sands Trust, they can get details where it can be purchased on the internet.
I want to thank you, Danny, for joining us. It's been great having you on the show.
Thank you, Wasim.
Thank you all for joining us as well. Hope to see you all again soon. Take care and bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Very much.